So this is like the best text for me ever, because I feel like it is the one time I can actually tell Jesus that he has messed up big time. I mean, seriously, we have a funeral procession, and we aren't talking about a funeral procession with cop cars slowing down traffic for dark sedans, and we aren't talking about people all snuggled closely in their cars as the world sort of goes on around them. No, this is a true procession, the walking kind of procession. The entire town has gathered as the body is laid out for all to see. And he is carried by hand on a stretcher through the entire town and out the gate. There's no hiding. And the mother is weeping. And everybody can see her weeping as she walks. And she weeps for herself. And she weeps for her son. And she weeps for the loss of life. And it's not just her life, his life that's lost, but it's also hers. Everything has been taken away from her. And so she also is laid out bare for everyone to see. Because everyone knows that her one and only source of security has been stripped away from her. So she might as well start to count down the days too. Because in some ways, this is her funeral procession. So I would be weeping too. I would be crying my eyes out. Which brings me back to how Jesus really messes up. She has every reason to completely break down. And Jesus says, don't cry. I'm telling you what, this is the exact wrong thing to say. Every single person who has ever taken any type of pastoral counseling class or had any type of compassion training, or if you've ever experienced pain or hurt yourself, you know that the last thing in the world you want to be told is, don't cry, it's going to be okay. You just don't say those things, because it doesn't feel like it's going to be okay. And I don't know, to have some stranger, because she doesn't even know who this Jesus guy is, to have some stranger come up and tell her not to cry, I'd want to punch Jesus in the face. Maybe if I knew he was a savior of the universe, I'd feel differently, but I don't. If there's anything I've learned, or that I'm sort of learning, is that whatever you feel in these deep, dark moments of life is okay. And that it's okay to have no explanation for how you feel. And that it's okay to cry. And that sometimes it's even necessary. And Jesus knows this. In the Bible, Jesus even weeps some. But that's a little bit besides the point. Because here, in my opinion, Jesus says the wrong thing. And the world careens to a stop. The procession stops, dead in its tracks. Have you ever watched a procession stop? It doesn't matter what type. It can be a parade. It can be a funeral march. It can be a presidential cavalcade. It can be a walk for hunger. It can be a marathon. Any type of procession knows where to go, and it understands its purpose based on a goal. And when it's stopped, now what? People who have been singularly focused all of a sudden wake up in confusion. Movements are no longer made with predictability, and your purpose is no longer clear. And in a procession, if there are security officers involved or guards, they are now on high alert, with eyes searching and ears listening. Because the truth is that when security officers actually have to begin to respond, that's when you know that any sense of security you once had was false. Nobody wants a procession to stop. Because once the procession stops, you don't know what's going to happen next. See, when our hearts are bursting and our heads are filled with swirling emotions, there's something about moving. There's something about staying busy that helps. It's like we think if we keep on moving, then we must be making progress. We must be going someplace. And that someplace must be better than here. And so we process and we move. This is one of those stories that seems so far-fetched. This is the first time in Luke when Jesus does something like this. Something this miraculous. And he's totally up to the ante. Because Jesus has been healing people with paralysis, or those with demons, or those with skin diseases, and once he even had people catch a whole boatload of fish. But he's not done anything like this. No dead people. So why do this downright crazy act? See, I don't know about you, but I can get my head around things like healings and abundance and new life because I've seen them occur. But this defeating death in this way, in this very public, not at the sort of end of age way, but in this moment of raising somebody from the dead way, I can't really get my head around that. So I prefer to not have to go down that path because it just doesn't seem like real life. But it also seems ridiculously unfaithful of me not to address it. And so I thought about this story, sort of about like what the fallout is from the story. And the question is it really about the dead man being raised? Is that the point of the story? And I don't think so. Because see, the guy on the stretcher, he's actually good to go. He's dead. He doesn't have another care in the world except for maybe which cloud he's going to take up residence on. The story isn't about the dead guy coming back to life, or even wanting to come back to life. It's about the mother, and it's about the other people in the town. And not only that, it is a story about us. It's about what Jesus does to and for them. It's about stopping the procession. See, it's really ironic, because what Jesus shows them, and he shows us, is that the procession wasn't about burying the dead. If it was, then that would have been okay. That would have been proper and appropriate. Yes, we bury the dead. But this procession, it was about burying the alive. And that just isn't okay with Jesus. Dead people get buried, not alive ones. This woman wasn't only burying her son. She was burying all her hopes and dreams. She was burying all sense of security, and she was burying all sense of independence. Every step the townspeople took towards the tomb inched them closer to their own tombs. They are, in some ways, the walking dead incarnate. Well, a couple weeks ago, you may remember that I said I'd be preaching on the Psalms, because we hardly ever do that. And here I am preaching on the Gospel. But there's a reason for that. The Psalm and the Gospel fit very well together, very poetically, actually. Because death is the main threat from which the psalmist sought deliverance. But the problem isn't death. The problem is dying before your time. And the psalmist was dying before his time. Because if you look at that psalm, what death really is that which threatens the living. That which brings the living down into the pit. That which steals away the dance of life. And the psalmist sings about that. About facing death and then being surprised to find life. See, I think what we often knowingly or unknowingly do is we follow grief and pain to where death wants us to go. And death wants us to go to the pit. Death wants to lead us out of town and to the tomb. Death wants to live, even in life. So Jesus stops the procession, not because of the sadness and the death, but because grief doesn't have to end at the tomb. Grief can give way to life. The only reason to say don't weep is when it isn't time for the funeral procession. And it isn't time for the funeral procession. It isn't time for your funeral procession, for my funeral procession, for their funeral procession. You might think it is, but it isn't. Your life doesn't get to be buried. Jesus isn't going to stand by and let you walk towards death. This I know. I don't get to say to somebody, don't weep, but Jesus can. Because Jesus' whole life wasn't about fixing our sinful nature. Jesus' whole life was teaching us about how to live. Jesus' whole life was about giving us life. Now, I don't know about you, but sometimes I can't stop. I can't stop moving. I can't stop thinking it's the end. I can't help but think life is too much to bear. And I can't help but walk down that road and participate in the funeral dirge. And what I was going to say, originally I was thinking that there's two processions. That there's a procession to the tomb and there's a procession to life. But as I thought about it, that's not what Jesus does. Jesus stops them at the gate, stops them as they're leaving town. Because there is a procession to death. We can take steps away from life, slowly. But life, it can happen in a moment. With a touch, with a word, with a song, or with a tear. And so that's the promise. That Jesus will stop us and turn us back around to face the city. Turn us back around to face life. I need that. And I bet you do too. And it might be a little bit chaotic. There might be more questions raised as life springs forth. But that's what happens when the procession is stopped. That's how the dance of life begins. The promise is that weeping may spend the night, but that joy will come in the morning. The promise is that our wailing will be turned to dancing. The promise is that at the gate, new life begins. So unfortunately, I have to admit that Jesus is right. The only type of weeping I can do when given a chance at new life is weep tears of joy, not tears of death. So I sort of lost my shot to take on the Savior of the world. But I can say this. May you know that with the rising of each new day, that there is a chance to dance. And may you know a touch which stops you in your tracks. And may your tears soothe your soul and give way to laughter. And may you know all these as visits of Jesus upon your life.